I just wanted to visit my father's grave. But then Karen showed up and turned everything into a disaster. She not only violated the resting place, but she also thought she had the right to decide everything. What would you do if someone secretly violated your loved one's resting place? Could you just let this intruder get away with it? Have you ever met someone like Karen, someone who thinks they have control over everything? Share your story below this video. I'm Daniel. I live in a small, quiet neighborhood where the family cemetery lies at the end of a cobblestone street. The tall trees provide plenty of shade, and a gentle breeze whispers through the leaves, carrying the earthy scent of the ground. This is where my mother and I often come to remember my father, a strong, resilient man who was always gentle with his family. After he passed away, we chose the cemetery, near the house he loved, for his final resting place. This morning, I left home with a white flower in hand. The soft sunlight filtered through the window, casting a pale golden hue across the quiet room. I stood before the mirror, my heart heavy. All these years, but every time I come here, I still feel like my father is watching over me, as if, with a single word, I could hear his voice. I slowly stepped out onto the street, listening to the birds singing in the early breeze, as if this would be a peaceful morning. But no. As I neared the cemetery, I stopped in my tracks. A jarring sound broke the silence, the noise of an excavator. The cemetery gate stood wide open, dust swirling in the air. A feeling of unease rose in my chest as I hurried inside. And then, my heart seemed to drop to the floor. My father's grave had been dug up. The earth was uneven, bricks scattered everywhere. The flower beds I had planted were uprooted, mixed in with the pile of dirt. I couldn't believe my eyes. This wasn't a nightmare, it was happening right in front of me. "Stop it now!" I shouted, my voice hoarse with anger. The workers froze, awkwardly setting down their shovels. A man in a gray uniform approached, his face filled with confusion. "We're just following orders. Mrs. Karen said this grave is on her family's land, so it has to be moved." I was stunned. Karen? I couldn't believe it. Some strange woman thought she had the right to decide where my father could rest. I gritted my teeth and lunged forward, intending to push the workers away from the disturbed earth. But before I could do anything, a shrill voice called out from behind me. "Who gave you permission to come in here and make a scene?" I turned around sharply. A woman stood there, arms crossed, her blonde hair neatly styled, her face carefully made up, but her eyes cold and sharp like a razor blade. "Karen." She looked at me as though I were the intruder. I clenched my fists, my blood boiling. "What the hell have you done to my father's grave?" My eyes were burning with fury. "Why did you dig up my father's grave?" I growled, feeling my chest burn with rage. "He's been resting here for years. Never bothered anyone." Karen folded her arms, a slight smirk on her face. "I don't like having an unfamiliar grave near my family's land." Her tone was icy. "This land belongs to my family. I'm just rearranging things to suit." "Suit?" I gritted my teeth. "My father is no longer alive. He can't disturb anyone. You have no right to violate his resting place." Karen shrugged, her tone chillingly nonchalant. "I have the right. This land is under my management, and I don't want a foreign grave next to it." My anger flared. My father's grave had been here long before she moved into this neighborhood. I tightened my fists, feeling like I was about to explode with rage. Karen didn't let me react, turning to the workers, ordering, "Keep going. Don't let him disrupt this." I couldn't stand it anymore. I pulled out my phone and called the police. The sound of the phone ringing stretched my desperation. A while later, the police arrived. They ordered everything to stop and made a report. Karen stood with her arms crossed, her face as cold as ever, but her voice was still defiant. "I'm just exercising my rights. This land belongs to my family. A foreign grave here doesn't meet standards." The officer reviewed the paperwork, spoke with the cemetery manager, then looked up, his voice firm. All digging will stop until the origin of the land is clearly confirmed. Karen's face turned pale. She was furious but could do nothing. I stood by my father's grave, feeling like I had just gone through a nightmare. My mother rushed over, tears streaming down her face when she saw what was left. "What have they done to your father?" Her voice cracked with emotion. I tried to comfort her, but inside, I was boiling. I wouldn't let Karen win. That evening, when I got home, my wife, Sarah, was waiting for me. "What's going on?" she asked, worried. I heard Mom calling. She was frantic. I hugged her tightly, speaking softly, but with determination. "Karen." She dug up my father's grave. Sarah took a deep breath, her eyes red with fury. "We can't let her get away with this. No one should be allowed to do that." I set to work. I went through all the paperwork to prove the land was legally ours. My father had been buried according to the proper regulations. No one had the right to touch it. Then I uncovered the truth. Karen had lied. Her land was to the west, completely unrelated to where my father rested. But she had twisted the facts, trying to extend her boundaries and push us out. I contacted a lawyer, filed a complaint with the authorities, demanding Karen be stopped immediately. News spread quickly through the neighborhood. Neighbors were up in arms. "She's harassed me before." One neighbor spoke up. "She thinks she can control everything," another added. No one accepted Karen's inhumane behavior. The whole neighborhood signed a petition to send to the authorities, demanding action. Karen remained defiant. She declared, "I have papers proving this land belongs to my family. The law will side with me." But no. The police worked with the local land authorities to measure the area. The results were clear. Karen had committed fraud. She had no claim to this land. Digging up my father's grave was completely illegal. One of the officers called me. "We have enough evidence. She has illegally trespassed and disturbed a burial site. We're taking this to court." For the first time in days, I felt a weight lift off my chest. Justice had begun to speak. I knew Karen wouldn't give up easily, but I had to try one last time. Late that night, I stood before her house. The soft light from inside spilled out, casting a faint glow on the front steps. I took a deep breath and knocked 3 times. The door opened. Karen appeared, draped in a luxurious silk robe, but her face froze when she saw me. "You again?" She crossed her arms, sneering. "I thought you'd given up." "This isn't over, and I guarantee you won't beat me." I looked her straight in the eye, forcing my anger down. "You know, everyone eventually has to lie down. No one can separate their family from this world by digging up someone else's grave. My father is gone, and he deserves to rest. Stop before it's too late." Karen scoffed. "You think I'm scared? You in this community can't do anything. I have money, I have connections, and I will do whatever it takes to make sure your father's grave disappears from here." I clenched my fist, each word coming through gritted teeth. "You will pay for this." I turned and walked away, leaving Karen's distant voice behind. "That land is mine. No one can stop me." The following days were a nightmare. I ran between the police station, the lawyer's office, and local government offices. Every time I came home, I saw my mother sitting by the table, staring at my father's photo. "What will they do next?" she whispered, her hands trembling as she gripped an old handkerchief. I squeezed her shoulder, speaking with certainty. "They won't do anything. I won't let it happen." Sarah tried to comfort me. "You have to stay strong. The whole neighborhood is standing with us." She was right. As the story about Karen spread, I started receiving support from the neighbors. No one accepted her inhumane actions. People gathered outside the cemetery, watching Karen's every move. They signed petitions, calling for action against her. And then, I discovered the horrifying truth. Karen wasn't just trying to erase my father's grave. She had a bigger plan: to turn the entire cemetery into a private burial ground for her family. transforming it into a luxurious space reserved only for her lineage. I found a leaked document, a proposal Karen had submitted to the local council to rezone the cemetery. The proposal had been rejected, but Karen had secretly proceeded with her plans, disregarding the law. My father's grave was just the first target. I handed the document to my lawyer. "We'll use this against her." The media got involved. A local news station reported the story, interviewing me, my mother, and several neighbors. "An unacceptable act," an elderly woman exclaimed. "She thinks she can control everything." Karen remained defiant. "I'm in the right. This is my family's land. I have the right." But the pressure kept mounting. Public opinion was rising. The people in the neighborhood, those who had suffered under Karen's reign, stood up to expose her. Old stories resurfaced. Karen had forced a neighbor to tear down a windbreak just because it blocked her view. She had belittled others, giving orders as if the whole neighborhood had to obey her. This time, she had gone too far. And then the fateful day came. The police called me. "We've completed the measurements and compared the documents," the officer said. "Karen has no claim to the land where your father's grave is. Furthermore, her actions violated the law on grave desecration and personal property. We'll recommend administrative penalties and possibly take this to court." I closed my eyes and let out a long breath. Karen would not escape the consequences. And I, at last, had regained peace for my father. Even Karen's career was caught in the storm of public outrage. She had been a board member of a well-known charity in the city. But once news of her grave desecration spread, the organization was quickly engulfed in criticism. "We can't allow someone with such inhumane behavior to represent our organization," one board member declared during an emergency meeting. Karen, still oblivious to the seriousness of the situation, scoffed. "You're all overreacting. I have the right to that land. Why should I be held accountable for doing the right thing?" But the board wasn't having it. A press release went out the next day. "Our organization cannot accept actions that go against humanitarian values. We demand that Karen step down immediately." Cornered, Karen angrily threatened to sue the organization. "I won't let you ruin my reputation." But no one cared anymore. Karen's power collapsed right in front of her. I vividly remember the moment Karen was brought to the police station for an official statement. As she walked out, her face was ashen, and her usual arrogance was gone. The crowd of neighbors had been waiting outside. "Do you even know what you've done?" An angry voice rang out. "Shameful." Karen said nothing, just lowered her head and quickly climbed into the car waiting for her. She was no longer the powerful woman she once was, just a lone figure, avoiding the judgmental gaze of the entire community. I stood there, watching as her car disappeared down the street. Part of me wanted to say something final to her, but I understood it no longer mattered. Justice was being served. In the days that followed, I poured all my energy into fixing my father's grave. The community had stood with me, and now they continued to help restore peace to the cemetery. My mother knelt down, gently placing a white flower on the restored tombstone. Her tears fell, but this time they weren't out of sorrow, but relief. "Your father must be so proud of you." One day, a cemetery employee came to find me. She looked at me with remorse in her eyes. I sincerely apologized. "I work for Karen, following her orders without thinking." She bowed her head. "But I can't continue working for someone like her. I've quit." I placed my hand on her shoulder, my voice softening. "I don't blame you. What matters is that you recognize your mistake and made the right choice." She smiled, relieved. The local court opened a trial for Karen. The evidence was clear. She had no claim to the land, and her actions of digging up the grave were illegal. Karen was fined heavily, but the price she had to pay didn't stop there. She was shunned by the community. Old friends slowly started to avoid her. Those who had once admired her power now turned their backs. I heard she was selling her house, planning to leave the neighborhood. But no matter where she went, She could never erase her disgrace. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't want anyone to fall into misfortune, but I couldn't pity her. Everything that happened today was a result of her own actions. One afternoon, I unexpectedly ran into Karen at a local grocery store. She looked worn out, her carefully styled hair a mess, her eyes sunken from sleepless nights. As she fumbled with some receipts, she suddenly looked up and saw me. For a moment, I saw hesitation in her eyes. Finally, she spoke, her voice so soft I could barely hear. I'm sorry. Those two words came out with difficulty, but perhaps they were all she could say. I stood silently for a moment before nodding. Live better. Nothing more. She lowered her face and hurried away, as if afraid to confront her past. I stood there, watching her retreating figure. Was she really remorseful? Or was she simply regretful for losing everything? But I realized that it no longer mattered. Justice had been done. My father's grave was protected. And that's all that mattered. Sunday morning came, and I returned to the cemetery. The warm sunlight bathed the gravestones, and the wind whispered through the trees. I gently placed the white flower on the stone engraved with my father's name. "Dad," I whispered, "it's all over now." My mother stood beside me, her gaze softening, the worry fading. A few neighbors stopped by, bringing small pots of flowers. They didn't say much, but their eyes spoke volumes. I bowed my head, as if speaking to my father. "Rest easy, Dad. No one will dare disturb your resting place anymore. I'll always visit, and I'll continue to honor the lessons you taught me." And I knew wherever he was, my father was smiling. Karen may leave this neighborhood, or perhaps she'll stay hidden in the streets she once walked through with such arrogance. Either way, her life has been changed forever. All that once seemed like power, control, and status is now nothing but ashes. I'm not sure if Karen truly regrets it, but I hope she's learned a valuable lesson. No one has the right to trample on the dignity of others, especially those who have passed. Society can forgive mistakes, but it won't tolerate arrogance and cruelty. And once the community rises together, no injustice can stand. For me, after everything that's happened, I've realized something important. There are times when we just want to live peacefully, avoid conflicts and disputes. But when something sacred is violated, we cannot step back. We must bravely stand up, not out of hatred, but for justice, for what deserves to be protected. The sunset spread a soft golden orange light over the cemetery, the trees swaying gently in the late breeze. I touched the stone engraved with my father's name, feeling the warmth of the last rays of sun. In my heart, a belief began to grow. All pain, all injustice, if we are strong enough to face it, will eventually pass. My mother placed a bouquet of flowers on Dad's grave, her eyes still filled with sadness, but less troubled. She sighed softly, perhaps feeling relieved after days of struggling between frustration and despair. Sarah stood beside me, her hand gently squeezing mine, as if to say, "We made it through." I nodded, walking with them out of the cemetery. The old iron gate creaked softly as we left, like a farewell to the story that had come to a close. The next day, I went to the police station to complete the formalities for my complaint against Karen. The officer looked at me with satisfaction, handing over the stamped documents. "It's done. You can rest easy now. The law has spoken, and no one will dare touch your father's grave again." I took the documents, nodded quietly. "Thank you." As I left the police station, I took a deep breath. The sky was clearer, the wind fresher. Perhaps not because of the weather, but because the worry in my heart had finally been lifted. In a small corner of my mind, I remembered the question I once asked. Did you let the intruder desecrate your loved one's resting place? Now I have the answer. I couldn't, and I never will. Sometimes we fear trouble, fear confrontation. But if we stay silent, if we let people like Karen trample on sacred values, then one day we'll lose the most important things. I hope that anyone who hears this story, even just briefly, understands the meaning of respect. Respect for the deceased, for morality, for compassion. And most importantly, never let a Karen think they have the right to trample on the most valuable things. That afternoon, I returned to the cemetery. I don't know why I came back here again. Maybe I wanted to see my father's resting place at sunset, when the light turned the gravestones and grass golden, and when the atmosphere became strangely peaceful. The wind blew gently, carrying the faint scent of the newly planted flowers. I bent down, gently brushing the stone of my father's grave, whispering, "Dad, I did it. I still remember you every day, still hear your teachings. I hope you can rest easy." I closed my eyes briefly, letting the breeze gently touch my face. A strange feeling crept in, like my father was somewhere, proud of his son. From a distance, a few neighbors happened to walk by. They stopped, nodded at me, their eyes full of respect. I smiled back. Through this experience, I understood that the community is not just a group of people living in the same neighborhood, but those willing to stand together when what is right needs protection. From pain, we learned the value of unity. The sun slowly dipped behind the trees. I looked back at my father's grave, one last time. The white flowers still fresh on the stone, symbolizing purity, filial piety, and a longing for peace. I turned away, taking slow steps out of the cemetery. The dry leaves crunched beneath my feet. In my memory, my father's voice echoed, "Remember, we must stand up to protect what's right, especially when protecting the dignity and honor of family." I smiled. Through everything, I understood the meaning of that lesson. Life is full of challenges. Sometimes, we are forced to face those with no compassion. But as long as we hold on to our faith, stand together, and believe in justice, nothing can defeat us. And in the end, when looking back at everything, I just want to say one thing. No one has the right to desecrate the dignity of others. And sometimes, you have to stand up to protect your values. Do you think Karen went too far? Does she deserve this? Have you ever encountered someone like Karen? Share your story below this video. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the Crazy Neighbor Drama channel for more thrilling stories.